Speaking of sort of the history of Texas Rangers, can you give us a brief history on this elite group?
There's two things if you're going to come away with just a brief understanding. So first of all, the Texas Rangers we know today are an elite law enforcement investigative force, akin to they're often compared to the FBI, the Scotland Yard, the Canadian mounted police. But they didn't start out that way. They started out their history. If you really want to track it back, it tracks back to the northern frontier of New Spain. And there were these units called flying companies, compañías volantes, flying companies. And those flying companies specifically developed some tactics, some mounted combat tactics that they referred to as perseguir y batir, pursue and strike. And this came about in the wake of the 1680 Pueblo Revolt, where a Spanish captain who had one of those long Spanish names that I would just totally butcher, even if I tried to say it. But he was a Spanish captain, and a captain in the Spanish military at that time was more akin to what we would consider a colonel or maybe even a brigadier general. Very high rank, very high rank. And he's part of a presidial review. The presidios are the forts of the Spanish frontier. And they're, a fort, usually made out of stone, if at all possible, sometimes wood, but, it was a building where their troops were housed and could defend this spot. And it would be next to, hopefully, a community development. They're trying to bring in and develop, Spanish communities on the northern frontier, and they would be there to protect them. But what this Spanish captain explained was that the Plains Indians, the Indians of the northern frontier, do not fight like we do. They do not fight like in European style, where they line up on a battlefield against you and charge at each other. They don't do it. There are, and many of them by this time have horses. Horses had been brought over by the Spanish, but they had many of them had gotten loose and gone wild and had been captured by various tribes. Most notably the Comanches had become really strong horsemen, and but the Apaches too, and others. And so they would raid, they would come in and they would hit you, they would take what they could, and they would run off back into their hidden villages and communities, which often, for many of them often, changed over time anyway. They didn't just have like a city or town that they lived in, 365. They actually, they were still in kind of a hunter-gatherer mode, many of them, and would move their home sites, to different places over different parts of the year. And so you had to pursue them. You couldn't just, engage them. You had to pursue them and strike them where you could find them. And so by the time the Anglos under Stephen F. Austin start showing up in Texas, the Tejanos have been doing this, and these flying companies been serving in this capacity for generations. And so even while Austin is down in Mexico trying to secure his father's his commission to settle families in Texas, people are already arriving. Families like the Kirkendales and the Tumlinsons, and they're arriving and they're settling in what's now Columbus. Near Columbus, the town of Columbus in Colorado County, and they're already facing problems with mainly at that point Karankawa Indians, and so they asked the Spanish governor Felix Tres Palacios. They say, how do we, can you send us some troops to defend us from these Karankawas? And he said, well, we don't have that. They've just come off of a 10-year war of independence, and their populations are depleted, their funds are depleted. They don't have standing troops that can come out there and defend these new colonists. They say, you've got to do that yourself. You got to break up into districts. And they told him how we do it on the Texas frontier. And then you've got to fight these guys that, you've got to pursue them and strike. He tells them about this. And so when Austin gets back in 1823, he sees one of these letters from Governor Tres Palacios, and he's reading these descriptions of how they need to operate. And he recognizes that as having similarity to a system that it was used in the United States, and then going back all the way to England, what they called in those homes rangers, or ranging. and where men would arm themselves and go out and patrol an area and and engage hostile forces where they found them. And so that's where he when he writes back, he's asking permission. Hey, well, can I actually, like, out of my own pocket, I'll fund it, but I'm like, can I put some guys to work and do what you've already got these guys doing? I want to put 10 guys of my own to work and doing that. Now that those 10 men, there's no record that ever came to fruition, that he ever put that group in the field. But he's referring to something that was already going on with and that was being commanded by the Kirkendalls and the Tumlinsons and others. And they were already out there in the field doing this. And then they continued to do this throughout the colonial period. And then under the Texas provisional government, it finally gets institutionalized as the, quote, Corps of Rangers. And that's what they are. They're this mounted military unit that, light cavalry that can pursue and strike their enemies when, in reaction, usually in reaction to raids and attacks of that sort. And it's a slow transition into law enforcement in the late 19th century, after the frontier closes in the wake of the Red River War in 1874. They've created what's called the Frontier Battalion. And now that there really isn't an Indian problem to deal with on the frontier, they've been given limited powers of arrest with that new law in 1874. And so they start tracking fugitives on the frontier. And then that kind of transitions into more and more of a law enforcement role. There's questions about that. They have limited authority, and there's even, lawsuits and, and threats of prosecution, because they're saying not only the officers, lieutenants and above would have that arrest authority. And so they changed the law once again in 1901. They create the Ranger Force. They make them full peace officers. And then the final transition, as I mentioned, with 1935 is when they create the Department of Public Safety. They take the Rangers out from under the Adjutant Generals, which is the state military arm, what we now call the National Guard. They take them out from under there and they put them together with the Highway Patrol, create some other bureaus as well to create the Department of Public Safety. And that's what still exists, but has continued to evolve in varying degrees to, until today. So they start out as military, but now they're investigators.